Welcome to the first in this year's speaker series, sponsored by the Heritage Library and Coastal Discovery Museum. Our theme for 2016 is the Changemakers. We will be highlighting those individuals who are making an impact in their fields on Hilton Head and across the region. If you didn't pick one up on the way in, we do have some schedules on the back that will be outside, conveniently located right next to the donation bowl. If you like what you're doing, if you like what we're doing, please let us know by donating generously. Our speaker tonight is South Carolina State Senator Tom Davis, who is the Republican representative for Beaufort and Jasper counties. Senator Davis was born in New Brunswick, New Jersey, graduated magna cum laude from Furman University in Greenville, South Carolina, and earned his law degree from the University of Maryland School of Law. He's a practicing attorney with Harvey and Batty? That's right. Thank you, in Beaufort. Tom was a former member of the Board of Directors for the Historic Beaufort Foundation, the Greater Beaufort Chamber of Commerce, Beaufort County Planning Board, Lowcountry Council of Governments, Beaufort Jasper Water and Sewer Authority, and South Carolina State's Ports Authority. He co-managed Mark Sanford's 2002 and 2006 gubernatorial campaigns and served in Governor Mark Sanford's administration as Senior Policy Advisor, Co-Chief of Staff, Deputy Chief of Staff, and Chief of Staff. Lastly, and to the point of tonight's talk, Tom chaired the Bi-State Jasper Port Negotiating Committee. It's a good thing we ran out of wine. Here tonight to tell us about that epic effort, please welcome Senator Tom Davis.
Good evening. Let me get my notes here. This is the distillation of about 3 file drawers full of files about the Jasper Port, which I've literally been working on for about 10 years. And hopefully I can make it succinct. I think what I'm going to do is talk for about 45, 50 minutes, and then open it up for question and answer for 15, 20 minutes, and have you guys out of here by 7:15. So I'll try to move quickly. But the first thing I'll note is I need to update my bio to say Princeton, New Jersey, instead of New Brunswick, New Jersey. It sounds so much better. And in fact, that's where my dad was in school at the time. And it's interesting that when you're in other parts of the state, you don't mention New Jersey. But if you're in Hilton Head, that's okay, because I'm one of you guys. But my wife and I, Reed, have been here for 31 years. I came here and joined the law firm of Harvey and Batty in 1985. Been with the same firm for 31 years. My law partner is here tonight, and he factors into some of the discussion I'm going to have tonight. But I'm going to jump right into it. The Jasper Port, and there are lots of ways, when they asked me to give this talk, there are lots of ways that I could have gone about lecturing to you about the Jasper Port. But I think what I'm going to do is give you some historical perspective as to how we got where we are today, who the players were involved in getting us to where we are today, because understanding that will help me discuss and help you understand what is yet to be done in order to make this a reality and something that benefits our entire region. So it's a story that you have to hear in order to understand the challenges that lie ahead. But where I want to start with is the stakes and the economic impact and what we're talking about doing when we talk about the Jasper Port. There was a study commissioned by the Jasper Ports Office, and Wilbur and Associates and University of Georgia did a study on what the economic impact of the Jasper Port would be for our region. And by our region, I mean the greater Beaufort, Jasper area. And the projection was that on completion of the Jasper Port, when all 10 berths were in place and were operational, and when all the rail and the roads and all the infrastructure you need to make a port operate, what you're talking about is 1 million jobs and $9 billion in annual tax revenues. Okay, so that's the prize we're after here. That's what we're driving after here. And it's truly something that has to be perceived as a game changer. It is, we talk about the corridor of shame. We talk about Jasper, Allendale, Hampton, Colleton, the counties that have no economic base, no jobs. This is a game changer for them. It is also something of great benefit to my region because Beaufort County, individuals and jobs, they need places to live, to shop, to get services. I mean, this is truly an economic venture that lifts all boats in this region. And so I first started working on this back in 2004 when I joined the Sanford administration, and I didn't serve in all those particular positions at one time. That represented sort of the ladder that I don't know if climbed is the right word, given the way it ended up, but eventually was chief of staff. And when I was chief of staff, I sat down with Mark, Governor Sanford, and I said, Mark, we've got in Jasper County what everybody in the shipping industry acknowledges is the last best remaining deep water port site on the East Coast. And he goes, well, I know that. I know that, Tom. I said, okay, well, now, do you know the history of the Jasper Port? And he goes, no, tell me about it. I said, well, Jasper County has been trying for a long time to develop a port on that site. Henry Moss, Jasper County Administrator, really one of the pioneers of this effort. And I'm reminded now that another pioneer and somebody that I've worked with for the past 10 years on this is no longer with us, and I've got to pay some tribute to him because when I was putting this together and going through those 3 drawers of files, there was so much correspondence between myself and the late Senator Clemente Pinckney. This was something that he and I worked on closely for 10 years. And the fact that we filed the application with the Corps of Engineers in November to finally make something that he and I had worked on for many years a reality, and that he wasn't here to see that, really affected me as I started to pull this together. And I wanted to go ahead and just make a point right up front, the role that he played consistently championing this throughout the process. But as I was explaining to Governor Sanford, I said, Jasper County tried to partner with a company called SSA Marine out of Washington State, a stevedoring company out of Washington State, to build a terminal on this Jasper Port site. And they went so far as to form a joint venture, and we're going about the business of trying to condemn the real property, which leads me to this piece of information that you have to understand the story. There's 10,000 acres of land in Jasper County near the mouth of the river that used to be marshlands, lowlands. That 10,000 acres was acquired by the Georgia Department of Transportation. They acquired fee simple title to the marshlands. And what they did over the last 50, 60 years that they own the property is they've taken the fill from their highway operations, or they've taken the fill from dredging the Channel and Savannah River, and they have filled that 10,000 acres up with silt. And they have the 10,000 acres, and if I were high-tech enough, I'd have a graph up here, and it would show you how that 10,000 acres is divided into a grid like a checkerboard. And they would literally have a hose that would be directed and moved from square to square as it got filled up. And then over the years, that marshland built up into a piece of land that was then compressed and then built up again. So that's what we're talking about here when we talk about the port site. The port site is a 1,500 acre component or a portion of that 10,000 acres, okay, that the Georgia DOT has been dumping the spoil on and building up over time. What Jasper County was attempting to do in collaboration with SSA Marine was condemn and to take 1,500 acres of that 10,000 acres. Jasper County, like other counties, have eminent domain power. They have the ability to file an action and have property taken from another party for a public purpose. As Jasper County and SSA Marine attempted to do that back in 2002, 2003, the State Ports Authority in Charleston, that owns and operates the port in Charleston, commenced an action against Jasper County, saying only we have the right in South Carolina to acquire, construct, maintain, and operate port facilities. Jasper County and the State Ports Authority fought that out. It got appealed to the state Supreme Court. And in 2004, I believe it was, the state Supreme Court issued a ruling saying, State Ports Authority, you're right. You're the one that has the right to condemn property, to establish a port, to operate a port. We've given you that authority statutorily. Counties are subordinate to your right to do that. Well, at that point in time, assessing the situation as Sanford's senior policy advisor, I said to Mark, we need now to do something on the state level to get the state interested in building this port, because the state Supreme Court said they're the entity. And so I started to have meetings with Sonny Perdue's chief of staff, or actually I think it was his chief operating officer. That was Georgia's governor at the time, a man named Jim Lentz was the chief operating officer. And I sat down in 2005 with Jim Lentz and said, Jim, there is this 1,500 acre tract of land in Jasper County on the Savannah River. He goes, I'm well aware of it. And I said, this is going to be something that Savannah needs someday, because Savannah is eventually going to build out on the TEU capacity. The Garden City Terminal is hemmed in by urban development. They can't really expand. At some point in time, you guys are going to need room to expand. And he goes, I agree with you there too. I said, Jim, well, let's do this. Let's meet with the Army Corps of Engineers, and let's figure out a way that we can do this together as two states. And this was nowhere near any sort of an agreement at this point in time. This was simply an idea that I had. I asked Governor Sanford, I could contact Governor Perdue's chief of staff or chief operating officer, and he said, fine. So we met with who was then the general of the Corps of Engineers for the Southeast region at that time, General Schrader. And General Schrader said, one of the things you guys, both of you here, need to realize is that on that 10,000 acres that the Georgia DOT owns, and the 1,500 acre portion of that on which you want to build this Jasper Port, do you realize that the Corps of Engineers has a perpetual easement on that site for the purpose of receiving spoil and having spoil disposed of? And I said, yeah, I knew you guys had that easement. I had done the title search on the property. They have a blanket easement over the entire 10,000 acres. And he goes, well, that's good that you know that. And did you know that the Corps of Engineers will never release its easement on that property unless the two states agree to do something together? And he said he remembered when Jasper County went to condemn that property on its own. And he remembered thinking to himself, well, what do we care if Jasper County condemns that 1,500 acres and takes it from the Georgia DOT? It's going to be taken subject to our easement. Our easement, being held by a federal government agency, cannot be extinguished by that foreclosure, by that condemnation action. And so at that point in time, it became clear to me and to Jim Lentz that the only way you were ever going to see an ocean terminal on that Jasper Port site is if we work cooperatively together, because the Corps of Engineers had stated that we're not going to side with one state against the other. You had two offices of the Corps of Engineers involved at that point in time. You had the Charleston Corps of Engineers because the land was located in Jasper County. You had the Savannah Corps of Engineers because it affected a channel, the Savannah River, over which it had jurisdiction. And the Corps of Engineers was saying, we have an easement and we're not releasing it. So I went back to Sanford, reported that to him, And he said, well, why don't we just go ahead and agree to do this together then? The two states will agree to do it together. And that, at some point in time, Charleston's going to run out of capacity. They're pretty much hemmed in there. They've got some room to expand, but Savannah and Charleston are both in metropolitan areas. They have, at some point in time, they've got a finite TEU capacity. And when I say TEU, that's 20-foot equivalency units. That's the way shipping commerce is measured. Those boxes you see trucks hauling out on the road. So TEUs is short for that. And so we drafted and I should refer to my notes here, I guess, because it's the first thing I kind of put here, a bi-state terminal agreement, or a bi-state term sheet, in March 12 in 2007, and it was simply a document that Jim Lentz and I outlined called a term sheet, and that's all it is. It is sort of a conceptual blueprint for how the two states might work together in regard to this matter. And some of you remember that when this was signed on March 12, 2007, that's when Governor Sanford and Governor Perdue met on that 1,500-acre piece of land upon which the Jasper Port is going to be built, and they exchanged ties as sort of a ceremonial gesture of the two states working together in this matter. After that agreement was signed, I then sat down with Jim Lentz and said, well, we need to do something to move this term sheet into something that is legally enforceable. It's good that we have this 40,000-foot conceptual recitation of our understanding that the two states will work together cooperatively to develop this terminal, but we now need to move it beyond that, and I'm a real estate lawyer in my remunerative life, and come up with something that we can actually work from. And so Governor Sanford appointed 3 individuals to negotiate an agreement. Governor Perdue appointed 3 on the Georgia side, and Jim Lentz and I chaired that task force to negotiate an actual contract between the parties. And we, in fact, did negotiate an intergovernmental agreement and signed it on January 27, 2008. So it took about a year, a little less than a year to negotiate. And it is a contract between the Georgia Ports Authority, the South Carolina State Ports Authority, and the Georgia Department of Transportation, with the Georgia Department of Transportation being the seller, because remember they own the 10,000 acres, and they were going to sell a 1,500-acre portion of it, and the Georgia Ports Authority and the South Carolina Ports Authority being the purchasers of that 1,500 acres. And they were purchasing those 1,500 acres as co-tenants, so they would each have a 50% undivided interest in the property. And that was something that we had to do in order to get the deal signed. And it creates some problems downstream, which I'll refer to. But remember, back to this point in time, when the deal was structured for the 2 ports authorities to acquire the property together, okay? What I then did after that agreement was signed is work with our congressional delegation in Washington, D.C., Lindsey Graham in particular, and Senator Graham deserves great credit for this, to have inserted into the Water Resources Development Act in 2008 a proviso that directed the Corps of Engineers to look into the possibility of developing a ocean terminal at the Jasper Port site, and to release the easement, the spoil easement that it has on the 1,500 acres upon the 2 states successfully coming together and forming an agreement to develop the port. Extraordinarily important that we did that, to go ahead and to memorialize the obligation and commitment of the Corps of Engineers to release that spoil easement, because it wasn't going to be worth our while on the South Carolina or Georgia side to spend the millions of dollars in terms of environmental impact, marketing studies, any number of things that have to be done in connection with a project like this if you've got a piece of dirt that's encumbered by a spoil easement. You had to have some assurance that at some point in time, if something happened, that easement would be lifted. And that proviso in the Water Resources Development Act that Senator Graham helped us get passed was that milestone. We got that accomplished at that point in time. In July of 2008, it was a big day because, or end of July 29, I think it was, right after Water Festival, I remember. The Georgia DOT actually conveyed the real property, the 1,500 acres, to the Georgia Ports Authority and the South Carolina State Ports Authority as co-tenants. $7 million was paid to acquire that real property from Georgia DOT, split equally by the two co-tenants. It was conveyed subject to the Corps of Engineers spoil easement because that was going to be released at some point into the future. But at that point in time, the two ports authorities could begin planning for a terminal in Jasper County. Now, title is vested to this day in the Georgia Ports Authority and the South Carolina State Ports Authority as tenants in common. They each have a 50% undivided interest. But the governing authority and the entity that makes decisions in regard to that property retains third-party contractors, files permits, does all the economic activity associated with developing the tract, is performed by a group called the Jasper Ocean Terminal Joint Project Office. Okay, so that's typically referred to as the JPO. So when you hear people talking about the JPO, they're talking about the entity that actually makes the decisions in regard to how to develop that tract, even though fee simple title is held 50-50 by the two ports authorities. And the way the JPO is set up is that there are 3 individuals from Georgia and 3 individuals from South Carolina. On the Georgia and the South Carolina side, 2 individuals each are appointed by the ports authorities, and then 1 individual each in South Carolina and Georgia is appointed by the governor. And my law partner, Coligny, is the governor's appointee in South Carolina on the JPO. Okay, and so the JPO meets on a regular basis, and it's the one that makes the decisions in regard to how to move the project forward. And the JPO hired an extremely reputable company called Moffitt & Nichol that is very experienced in developing ports, permitting process, to do the market analysis, the engineering, all the logistics, to identify infrastructure needs. And so all of that work began like in 2010, and voluminous studies were prepared, which then culminated last November with an actual filing of a permit to build the ocean terminal with both the Corps of Engineers in Charleston and the Corps of Engineers in Savannah. And again, it had to be filed with both offices because, again, the land and the dirt is in South Carolina, falling within the Charleston jurisdiction of the Corps, but the channel upon which it would rely falls within the Savannah Corps' jurisdiction. But paperwork was filed in November, and at that point in time, it no longer was a question of if there was going to be an ocean terminal. The question became when. We had moved beyond the concept, moved beyond the idea, and we started to break some eggs and start to move forward in the environmental permitting process. And so that's where we are today. We're going through an EPA permitting process, a NEPA process, that will probably take 4, 5, 6 years, depending upon the complexity and the number of objections that are raised, the need for litigation, whatever the more detailed studies show. But the important thing to understand is that we're now on a timeline, a 5-year timeline, to get the project permitted. The idea of the JPO is that once permits are in hand, at that point in time, RFPs will be issued to have individuals, companies, pension funds, shipping lines respond to developing with their capital, private capital, on a 60, 70-year long-term lease, perhaps a concession basis, a facility on that tract of land. So at the end of 5 years, hopefully we'll have permits in hand. Over that 5-year period, what we also need to be doing to get ready to issue those RFPs will be infrastructure improvements like Highway 17 going from 2 to 4 lanes, having a port access frontage road as you go down 17 toward the Talmadge Bridge, having it extend left, or I guess they're looking at, it'd be southeast toward the mouth of the river, that port access road. We need to make arrangements so that dual rail access with Norfolk Southern and CSX, both of which serve the facility or the terminal in Savannah, in Georgia, having those rail lines extended down in a way that provides immediate access to the Jasper Port. An interchange, perhaps on I-95, that could accommodate the traffic. A number of things in terms of infrastructure we need to be doing during that 5-year period as well. So as we're going forward and as we're getting those particular permits from the federal government, the Corps of Engineers, and the various resource agencies associated with that, there are things we can be doing in regard to infrastructure, because when we send those packets out for bid, the bidders are going to want to know that they've got something that they can actually, that you've got rail, that you've got roads, that you've got access. And so we're at a busy time right now. Now, why is 5 years important? Because the 5 years it's going to take to permit, and the 3 or 4 years or 5 years after that it's going to take to actually construct the facility, put you right at the year 2025 and 2026. And that's an important date because that is the date that it is projected that the TEU capacity for Savannah and Charleston, which combined is about 11 million TEUs a year, okay? Combined, that's going to be, even assuming all the improvements that Savannah's making, Charleston's making with the Navy base, maxed out, their total TEU capacity will be about 11 million TEUs a year. And the projections are that by the year 2025, Charleston and Savannah will be right at about 80 or 90% of that TEU capacity, and looking for some excess capacity to handle what it can't handle. And the reason those projections are so rosy or optimistic in regard to Charleston and Savannah reaching that threshold or close to that threshold of 11 million TEUs is because of what's happening in the global shipping market in a couple respects. Most importantly, the new Panama Canal, or the Panama Canal that is being constructed, and I think Colton almost completed to be constructed, that's parallel to the existing canal, that can handle larger ships. And what you will see as a result of that are shipping lines and companies on a more frequent basis using East Coast ports instead of West Coast ports. Okay, so that's one fundamental dynamic here that's going to drive a huge demand in shipping capacity on the East Coast because of the Panama Canal. It just simply becomes, at some point in time, more cost-effective for companies shipping goods to not unload in Los Angeles or on the West Coast, but to continue on through the Panama Canal and come into the East Coast and have entry points on the East Coast. And this is widely acknowledged. You already see New York, New Jersey, Baltimore, Norfolk, other ports racing to increase their capacity to handle this anticipated increase in business. And the second thing driving the projections in regard to getting to that 11 million TEU capacity in Charleston and Savannah by 2025 is something that we read about every day, that the increased exports and the manufacturing and the things that are happening in the Southeast and just the robust economic activity that we have happening in our neck of the woods gives rise to more exports. And the Southeast is the fastest growing area in the United States, which then in turn gives rise to a need for imports. So you've got both demographics in terms of people, and you've got manufacturing activities driving imports and exports respectively. So that's one reason for the Jasper Port. And you've got to demonstrate to the Corps of Engineers what's called, when you file like they did an application with the Corps, you have what's called a needs analysis. You have to demonstrate to the Corps there's a need for this particular facility. They're just not going to allow you to have an ocean terminal simply because you file an application. You've got to demonstrate to the Corps that there is an economic need. The first prong of that economic need showing by the JPO is just what I've just said, the increased shipping activity because of the Panama Canal expansion, because of the exports, because of the imports. But equally important, and it's a fascinating development that's occurred just in the last couple of years, is that most major shipping lines now, Maersk Sea Land in particular, are purchasing mega Panamax ships, called mega Panamax ships. Now, Panamax meaning, the Panama Canal maximum ships. But moving from the 8,000, 10,000 TEU ships to ships that carry up to 20,000, 21,000, 22,000 TEUs at one time. I mean, it's just an exponential increase in the amount of boxes that these ships are carrying. I mean, and it's an industry trend. And if you look at the purchasing patterns of a shipping line like Maersk Sea Land, you can see that's where they're putting their money. It's much more efficient for them to carry that many boxes at one time. Now, what does that mean for the Jasper Port? Well, it's important because up until just recently, the constraints that ports up and down the eastern seaboard were focusing on were in regard to channel width and channel depth. They were worried about being able to accommodate the drafts of the ships. What you're talking about in regard to this next generation of mega ships, though, when you talk about anything in excess of 14,000 TEUs, is a height restriction. The Bayonne Bridge, even if it's raised in New York, New Jersey, will only be able to accommodate a ship with 14,000 TEUs, no more. Charleston, because of the Arthur Avenel Bridge, cannot get a ship larger than a 14,000 TEU container underneath it. Doesn't matter how deep it is, doesn't matter how wide the channel is, it can't get under the bridge. Savannah with the Talmadge Bridge has a similar problem. They can't get anything larger than 14,000 TEU under it. There is a natural niche here for the Jasper Port, which is closer to the mouth of the Savannah River, which has no height constrictions, which has the ability to have this channel widened and deepened to accommodate and to be the only place on the East Coast that can accommodate this next generation of ships. I think that's a tremendously exciting thing for Jasper County to identify that niche. So as we move forward on a needs basis, as we move forward and make our case to the Corps of Engineers now, that there is a need for an ocean terminal in Jasper County, there is not only the argument that at some point in time the TEU capacity in 2025 is going to be exhausted because of the traffic that Savannah and Charleston can handle. There's also the argument supplementing that those ports even today, even if they got the deepening they wish for, cannot handle these ships. So I'm extremely sanguine about the possibility of this terminal becoming a reality because of those two very, very specific economic needs requirements that I believe can be met. And it's one of those things, I've been a real estate lawyer for 31 years, and I've been involved in this now for a little over 10 years. And it's been something that I've seen develop from just sort of a general idea with Jasper County trying valiantly to do something on its own, to something now that is actually filed and we're moving forward in a specific way with very compelling arguments. And it's an extraordinarily exciting thing to be a part of. And quite frankly, it's going to be something, and politicians aren't good at this. Politicians are good at something that happens in 1 year or 2 years, and you can point to something that you've done. This is something that really, it won't come online, and let's be frank, until 2025, 2026. I mean, that's just how long it's going to take. And we need to understand that, and we need to accept that time frame. And sometimes that's hard for us to kind of accept something that's in a 10-year time frame. But that's realistically what we're talking about here. But what you're going to see is as that process moves forward with the federal agencies, and as you see Highway 17 widened to 4 lanes, and as you see the Port Access Road constructed, and as you see CSX and Norfolk Southern extending their lines, and as the private sector sees these things happening, and they realize that Jasper County, Hampton County, Colliton County, these areas that have tremendously large tracts of land, economic activity is going to be anticipatory. They're going to want to come in. You're going to start to see the effects of this long before we actually unload the first box. And so it's something that, and I don't want to get too pejorative here, but I can't tell the whole story without being somewhat frank here and maybe a little bit abrasive. It's quite frankly something that Jasper Port is something that in their heart of hearts, I don't think the folks in Charleston really want. And I'm just being very honest. And Savannah too, as well. Perhaps not as much, but there's a mentality, a mistaken one in my judgment, that this is a zero-sum game, that somehow if there's business somewhere else, it must somehow come out of their hide. And the challenge has always been to convince them that we're not talking about that. We're talking about handling capacity that you can't possibly handle in the future, given the outcry. I mean, remember what happened in Charleston when they talked about developing Daniel Island into a terminal, and how the citizens of Charleston rose up, and they did not want to have that increased traffic. They did not want to have their quality of life impacted that way. I mean, and the same thing in Savannah. And so making the point to them that look, it's not coming out of your hide. We're talking about handling something you are going to be wanting us to be there. And you're a half owner of this, guys. And that goes back to the bittersweet thing. Remember I told you about, remember when title was taken by the 2 ports authorities. At the time, it was a political necessity. I couldn't make the deal work with Sanford, and it couldn't work with Purdue unless the 2 ports authorities took title to the property. I wanted the title of that property taken by an independent entity that simply had Jasper County's interests at heart, and they'd be the fee simple owner. But that wasn't a political reality. It was something back in 2007, 2008. It was a bitter pill that I quite frankly had to swallow, knowing that the 2 entities that probably in their heart of hearts wished that there'd never be a port in Jasper ended up owning the site. Okay, so that's sort of paradoxical way to think of it that way. And I feel it's important to let you all know that. I feel it's important to let you know that going forward, that when you hear things from the state ports authorities of Georgia and South Carolina, from which there are many good people, a lot of my good friends, I served on the ports authority, understand sometimes that they don't always have Jasper's interests first in their minds. And I understand that. If you're an institution and you've got capital and you've got a business operation, you're focusing on it, I understand how you're not going to pay attention to Jasper. But it's my job as your state senator, and in looking at something that beyond anything else we're possibly ever going to consider to be an economic game changer for our region, to take our region from being one based in the north of the county with military and in the south of the county on tourism and service industry, and to add a new component to the economic sector, it's extremely important. And it's something that I feel the need to watch out for every day, to make sure there isn't some effort to sidetrack it. I hate to speak in those terms, but it's important that you realize My senior law partner, Brantley Harvey, who was lieutenant governor, once told me about South Carolina politics. And he said the best way to describe South Carolina politics as if it were a bucket of crabs. And you have each of the crabs trying to get their way out, and just when one's about to get their way out, the other ones pull it back down. That's the way we are here in South Carolina a lot of times. When one area tries to get out of the bucket, all the other crabs figure that they might be hurt somehow, and let's pull that crab back down in here in case we get hurt. That's the mentality sometimes we're pushing back against. But we have pushed back against it successfully thus far. We've pushed back against it to the point where we have got this tract of land vested in a joint venture. We've got the Corps of Engineers agreeing to release their spoil easement. We have got the Corps of Engineers agreeing that for the next 6-7 years, as we are going through the permitting process, to direct their spoil disposal into the grid that involves our 1,500 acres to build that up so it becomes high enough to what we need to develop. We've gotten a commitment from the Corps that that spoil won't have any cadmium or other environmental contaminants, so we can actually build on it. We have gone ahead and we have filed the applications with an extremely reputable company and beginning the process of making the case. And I'm going to continue in the state Senate to make arguments in favor of the infrastructure with rail and Highway 17 and the other infrastructure we need in order to make that port viable. So I've probably already broken my promise and gone way beyond. No, I'm actually okay. It's 20 of. But I've tried to give you an idea from a transactional perspective of where it's come since Henry Moss, as Jasper County Administrator, had Jasper County combined with SSA Marine in that effort, and how it's moved forward since then to the posture that it's in now. My overall assessment of the entire thing is one of extraordinary optimism. Everybody, governors of South Carolina, governor of Georgia, the chairmen of both ports authorities, everybody now knows that there will be a Jasper Port. The question is, let's keep it on a timeline. Let's keep it within that 10-year window. That's what I'm focusing on. I'm focusing on a 5 or 6 year permitting window, and then a first phase build for the first 3 or 4 years. And again, if there's some slippage, okay, but you always have to have a time frame and you stick to it. That's what I work toward. Every year in the budget, I make sure that there's sufficient funds. Last year there was $1.5 million that gets appropriated by the General Assembly on our side to the JPO. Also, the Georgia side does the same thing to make sure that it's adequately funded, because these ventures are extraordinarily expensive. You need experts, you need studies, so that's moving forward. I'm optimistic, and now I'll be happy to answer your questions. How should I go about, I don't want to offend anybody, so I'll let you pick them. Oh. It's a politician's trick.
Larry, go ahead.
What about the terminal owners that we'd spoken to in SSA early on? Would they be huge in supporting becoming an ally too, especially with some of the boards of the ports authorities that don't really still want this and may have reason to delay? But wouldn't they be some of the best allies, because they're not only going to be investors, but they realize as well as anybody better that they're going to run out of capacity?
Yeah, the question is that SSA Marine that initially worked with Jasper and tried to do it on their own back in 2003, wouldn't they be allies in helping make this Jasper Port a reality? And the answer to that is yes. And there are a lot of participants in the shipping industry that are allies. They're anxious to see increased capacity on the East Coast. And quite frankly, SSA, I would hope and expect, given all the due diligence they've already done on the site, to be one of the respondents when the JPO, 4 or 5 years from now, with permits in hand to develop an ocean terminal and with highway infrastructure in place and with rail access in place, and you're issuing those RFPs, hopefully they would then be a respondent. And the idea there is, most ports throughout the world are privately run. South Carolina and Georgia are really the exceptions in terms of being ports that are owned and operated by public officials. The idea behind the Jasper Port has always been to leverage private capital in the same way that other port operations do, either on a long-term 60, 70-year lease basis or a 60, 70-year concession basis, because if you're going to ask a private sector respondent to put the capital in the ground, and we're talking about a couple $1 billion, you want to give them the exclusive right to then operate, to recover their capital investment and make a profit over time. And so the idea would be to get all these pieces together, issue RFPs, and then to accept the proposal that made the best sense in terms of delivering value to the people of South Carolina and Georgia. And I think that's sometimes what we forget about ports. The purpose of a port isn't to make a maximum profit. The purpose of a port isn't to deliver the largest return it can to shareholders. The purpose of a port is to provide to the people of South Carolina and Georgia a way to export and import their goods in a very competitive way. And sometimes, I think, quite frankly, ports lose sight of that fact. That the fact that they're turning a high profit doesn't necessarily make me feel good. What I want to know is, are the people using our ports being able to export and import in a way that makes them competitive? And so as we look at those RFPs, those will be the sort of things you look at. You'll look at what their models are. You look at what they intend to do in terms of marketing. What business will they go after? That's looking down the road 5 years from now, I'm sorry. But I hope SSA Marine is one of those that responds, because they spent a tremendous amount of money back in 2003 and 2004 trying to make this work with Jasper County.
I have a question that
Yes,
I
ma'am.
think is more legal, but you talked about it being tenants in common. Now that's equal tenants. You talked about tenants by the entirety.
Not by the
With-
entirety.
Okay, you said another type of tenant, and that is a tenant that you can't break apart.
They have title as tenants in common, and as tenants in common, under the agreement in which they purchased the real property, there are various buy-sell agreements back and forth. If things don't happen the way it's anticipated, there are various buy-sell rights that are triggered among the co-tenants.
Well, as tenants in common,
Mhm.
they can divide up any time, and that's what's concerning me.
They can unless they have contractually obligated themselves to do otherwise. And they have, in the intergovernmental agreement, agreed between themselves as co-tenants
That
if
they will not
that if certain,
divide.
that's right, that if certain things happen in the future and if the port does not come to fruition, there are certain buy-sell provisions that are triggered. It wouldn't go to a partition sale.
So we won't go to tenants by the entirety.
We don't have tenants by the entirety in South Carolina. You can't
Oh,
hold title as tenants, but
excuse
no,
me,
that's
I'm a
fine.
New York
No, that's
woman.
okay. That's okay.
Okay.
Yes, ma'am.
Oh, back here. Lou?
Senator, all these infrastructure improvements, the widening of the road and all that other, running the rails, how's that all gonna be financed?
The question was, the infrastructure that's necessary in order for a port in Jasper to be viable, and primarily we're talking about Highway 17 going from 2 to 4 lanes. We're talking about another bridge crossing over into Savannah that isn't 2 lanes. We're talking about the extension of rail from CSX to Norfolk Southern. That would have to be something shared by both South Carolina and Georgia. Even though the real property is located in South Carolina, it is an asset that is owned by the 2 ports authorities as co-tenants. Exactly how that happens, whether you're talking about General Assembly appropriations, whether you're talking about them making an application to the State Infrastructure Bank, whether you're talking about some other means through the Lowcountry Council of Governments, I don't know. But the 40,000 foot answer would be the two states would have to share in that burden, because the two states, as the owners, are going to reap the benefit of the rent payments that it receives from whatever third party bids. And so that's the best answer I could give right now, is that it would have to be something shared by both. And I think probably the subject of some negotiations as to how to best go about doing that. And that's the best I can say for right now.
Is this the only way we're going to get 95 widened to 3 lanes in South Carolina?
No, because and in fact, I had a meeting on this today with Christy Hall, the Secretary of Transportation, and I specifically discussed with her what DOT's plans were for the interstate grid, and by that I mean I-85 in the upstate, I-26 coming down across the state to I-95, I-20 connecting Aiken to Augusta, and then I-77 from Columbia up to Charlotte, that particular interstate grid. And there is a long-term 20-year plan that DOT has for fixing, maintaining, enhancing lanes, to your question, reconfiguring interchanges, particularly in regard to the Columbia area, if any of those of you are familiar with that. And that particular interstate grid upgrade is a priority item for the General Assembly. And so for purposes of I-95 and the 3 lanes and the better condition, and that's going to be a function of the priorities that the DOT and the General Assembly have stated in regard to the funds that are being dedicated. So that's going to happen, and that's one of the primary objectives for this coming legislative session, is to come up with a statewide plan with a recurring revenue source that is clearly identified to specific improvements, and primary among those is the interstate grid, and more to your question, the expansion of I-95. So while it will be of ancillary benefit to the Jasper Port, it's not the Jasper Port that's driving that discussion, I guess is a better way. Is that responsive?
It's going to take a gasoline tax increase to do it?
Well, that's an open question at this point. What we've got at this point in time is a discussion that'll begin tomorrow in that regard, in fact. And what you're looking at over the 7 years that I've been in the General Assembly, in 2009, my first year there, the total amount of dollars appropriated or authorized, and authorized is in regard to federal tax money, because that's what we authorize that. It was right at $1 billion in 2009. Last year, the budget that we passed and signed by Governor Haley appropriated and authorized $1.9 billion. Okay, so we've seen in the 7 years that I've been there a 90% increase in the annual amount of appropriations or authorizations to DOT and transportation. What you haven't seen are satisfactory results from those appropriations. You haven't seen maintenance occur. You haven't seen enhancements to roadways that are existing. What you've seen are new roads, quite frankly, being put into areas where neither economic need nor or the populace needs in order to evacuate. And it's a completely politically driven process. And it's no secret. I mean, I'm not saying anything that's earth-shaking here. You have 2 agencies in South Carolina that control the expenditure of the dollars we appropriate. We appropriate, the DOT and the State Infrastructure Bank then says how that money is spent. By design, both the DOT and the State Infrastructure Bank are controlled by 2 individuals, the Speaker of the House and the President of the Senate. They control the process. For many years, Bobby Harrell was the Speaker of the House from Charleston, and Glenn McConnell was the President of the Senate from Charleston. Most of the money went to Charleston. What we've seen since Bobby Harrell stepped down and somebody else came in, and we have seen Senator McConnell go into the private sector of the College of Charleston, and we have seen the President Pro Tem become Hugh Leatherman. So you've now got a speaker from the PD and a President Pro Tem from the PD. And Senator Leatherman, very frank, in a press conference said, I watched for many years how the highway dollars went into Charleston. Now's our turn. And my argument there is that's a third world way of deciding how to spend your dollars. And so when we talk about whether a gas tax is needed, okay, the first question has to be, what will the need be in regard to new revenues if the revenues we're already appropriating are spent in a proper way? Okay, so that's the first question. The second question is, this coming year, from existing tax sources, income taxes and sales taxes, it's projected that we're going to see $1.3 billion in new revenues, extra revenues over last year in the general fund. So instead of having a $7.2 billion general fund budget like we did last year, we're going to have an $8.5 billion general fund. I think there is a legitimate debate over whether a portion of that extra money ought to go to roads and bridges and bringing them up to snuff. And then after you have that argument, then you can talk about whether or not you need the gas tax. But the problem I have up in Columbia is that instead of trying to fix the politically driven way that we spend existing dollars, and instead of looking at existing resources and figuring out what we can dedicate, we jump right immediately to the gas tax and say raise it 75%. To me, you can't have a rational debate. I mean, if the gas tax is the variable X, you can't solve for X until you know what these other things are. And so that's my frustration, is that everybody wants to jump to X and raise the gas tax, dump it into this black box that hasn't given results for us over the last 7 years, and hope that on the other end it comes out. So that's the debate that you'll be reading about, and I'll be pilloried because I'm raising these questions and everybody up there wants to raise taxes. And at the end of the day, if we're allocating money wisely, and we make the structural reforms, and we look at existing revenues, and if we still need more money, all right, make your case for a gas tax. I have never signed a pledge saying I will never raise a tax. I have never signed that pledge because that's not responsible. I don't know what the needs are going to be. My argument has always been they want to jump to the end without making the argument.
One more.
Thank you, Senator, for your time and all this great information. One thing that is in my mind, and it's a simple, maybe a simple question. The number of people that you will need to live there and to run this port. How many people?
Well, I mean, if you're looking at the study, again, that was done by the University of Georgia and Wilbur Smith Associates out of Columbia, is that when the Jasper Port is fully built out, okay, when all 10, and it'll be staged, of course, you know, it won't be all built at one time, but when it's fully built out, and this is important to realize, we're talking about 1 million new jobs. We're talking, and that's, you know, to give you a sense of scale, we got 4.7 million people living in South Carolina right now. I mean, so you're talking about an economic engine that is going to be equivalent to what the Port of Charleston has done. And in terms of growth, the primary beneficiaries and where the people will move, and I think to your question, you know, I think you've got undeveloped tracts in Jasper and Colleton and Hampton and Allendale and Fairfield and all these counties. There's land, lots of land. There's access to highways, there's just no jobs. And so I guess the best answer I could give to that is it depends on the rate of economic growth. It depends upon where industry decides to locate. It depends upon patterns of where the rail lines are located. It depends on any number of things. But we are, in fairness, talking about something that's transformative for our region. And one of the things that I've always been proud about Beaufort County, and it's so important, and I'll take a moment here to kind of digress a bit. We've been so progressive in this county in terms of, I don't use the word pejoratively, it's a positive word, with our rural and critical lands initiative and in raising the money. And at 75-80% approval rates, people support in favor of it, of buying the lands necessary to our fragile estuarian system and making sure that the thing that brought me here and probably brought you here and the rest of you here isn't somehow sacrificed as a consequence of this economic development. And I have great confidence in our county to continue to do that. And I don't think this is a question of, do we keep what we have in terms of the quality of life, in terms of the cultural assets, in terms of the recreational assets. I don't think that the further expansion, and we've already got a port facility on the Savannah River, I don't think that the expansion of that port facility will impact that way of life. But that's, of course, a process that has to be gone through. I mean, that's why you have an EPA process. That's why you have public hearings where people can weigh in and you can make an assessment of whether or not the deepening of the channel is going to impact the aquifer at all. You can make an assessment of whether or not it's going to affect adjacent wetlands. All these things need to be hashed out, and they need to be. But I'm confident, looking at this, that the economic activity can be done in such a way as not to affect what makes Beaufort County special. In terms of the people, in terms of land, we've got plenty of land. We just need to have the jobs to bring them. So.
Thank you. Very good.
Okay, one more.
I'm happy to, as long you're a boss here. I'll be happy to stand here as long as y'all want me to, but Andy.
Senator Davis, thanks for your service. With the growth of South Carolina, we've heard the term tax credits and all the incentives we've given. I believe the number's $800 million a year. Are any of those sunsetted so down the road we'll be able to use that ability to offer tax credits to some of the people who potentially would help develop this area?
Andy's referring to a form of economic development that I would call, crony capitalism is too pejorative, but this whole idea that the way you generate economic growth is to package together a bunch of incentives in terms of subsidies, low interest bonds, exemption from property taxes, exemption from income taxes, and then taking those packages and then going out there and luring large companies to come in. And we hear often about the spectacular successes in regard to Boeing and BMW being two prime examples. What Andy's referring to is a lot of times these deals don't work out and companies don't meet their job threshold requirements, or they don't meet their capital investment requirements, and do those tax credits sunset at some point in time? The answer is they're supposed to. The real answer I can give you is I don't know, because they're subject to non-disclosure agreements, and the Commerce Department will say those are NDAs, and we don't know. And I would like to think that when the Commerce Department negotiates these packages, that not only do you have sunsets, but you have clawbacks. So to the extent that you've given subsidies or grants or monies, that if a company doesn't meet its side of the bargain, you claw back and get back from them. But again, I don't know whether or not they do or not, because they're subject to non-disclosure agreements, which I'm not a huge fan of that. I think the far better way, and this is getting off the topic, but I got y'all here, so I'll say it. I think the better way to address economic activity or productivity or quality of life in South Carolina is not by coming up with packages and then going out and luring large corporations. I think it's by lowering taxes for everybody. I mean, lowering sales taxes, lowering income taxes, lowering regulations, making South Carolina a place, because of its property tax and income tax structure, that it's a place where individuals want to come and invest their capital and bring their ideas. And I think by doing that across the board, you'll be much more effective than trying to load up the sleigh and try to bring somebody back, although that might make a great headline. You need to remember that for every incentive-lative package we come up with, that means higher taxes for everybody else. And it's the old fallacy, Bastiat's broken window fallacy. You never know what it is you don't get. I mean, you look at, it's tangible what you do get, but you never understand what you had to forego because of the economic climate that had to be suffered in order to get it. So anyway, long answer, different question, but there you go. Well, thank you all very much for having me. I hope you all learned something.
Here.